Hey, podcast listeners, welcome once again to Nonprofit Lowdown. Today, we are talking about real estate opportunities for nonprofits, and particularly since we're in New York City, I love real estate. It's kind of like the unofficial sport of New Yorkers, I think. Today, I'm joined by Stephen Powers, who is the co-founder of Open Impact Real Estate, and Amy Lawrence, who is the managing director. So welcome, Amy and Stephen.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for
Pleasure
having
to be on.
So before we jump into the meat of the conversation, Stephen, maybe we can start with you. Tell me a little bit how you got interested in the intersection of real estate and nonprofit.
Absolutely. Um, Growing up, I'm from Detroit, Michigan initially, and there had been a lot of work on urban renewal efforts and a lot of false starts, really. And I had seen how the built environment had sort of fallen apart in that city for the most part, especially in the urban core. And I went to college in St. Louis, and similarly, St. Louis had a long period of urban decline, and they had made some major progress. Though this is back in around 2000, in trying to refocus some energies on the center of the downtown and trying to bring back the whole live, work, play aspect of urban life that people like so much in New York City. And when I started to get, read more and more about it and learn about it, I realized that nonprofits play a really critical role in that urban fabric, providing a lot of the services that oftentimes the city doesn't provide and that the commercial sector doesn't provide, the arts and culture and the social services and things like food pantries and institutes of education and after school programs. Those really are what make urban centers particularly rich, because there's so much more offerings than you can get in a lot of the more suburban communities, because of the density and all the services being in one place. When I got my master's in real estate, they call that the benefits of agglomeration. And it's exciting to see, and in working with nonprofits, the role that real estate plays in delivering on their mission is really substantial. Without it, they can't really provide the types of services that they want if the environment doesn't suit it or if it's not located in the right way. And so we get the privilege of getting to work with these organizations during a really critical period of time and help them deliver on their strategic plan and mission through real estate.
I want to get into that a little bit more, but Amy, from you briefly, how did you get interested in the intersection of real estate and the nonprofits?
Absolutely. So I have always had an interest in sort of the power of business for positive change, not just for economic power, but also for social and environmental impact simultaneously. And when I went to business school to do my MBA in finance, I joined an organization called Net Impact. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, plug for them. They're a wonderful MBA organization that looks at exactly this. So I found these people that thought about things the way I did, right? About how can business do well and do good at the same time. It was a sort of novel concept, maybe 25, 30 years ago, less so now. And after getting my MBA in finance, I went to go work for a nonprofit, actually a public policy organization, the Aspen Institute, in their business and society program, where we were looking at exactly that and some of the things that Stephen was just talking about. When government or other institutions are not filling the role perhaps that they should, can nonprofits or for-profit organizations, impact-driven organizations, fill those spaces and have positive change while doing business, right? And so, I did a lot of work in the public policy space, but I'm a business person at heart. And I thought, how can I use my business skills? How can I help people do strategic planning and make good deals that make sense for them to support the kind of work, for profit or nonprofit, that they want to be doing? I happen to love real estate anyhow. And so all of these things sort of came together for me. In fact, that's the point in my life where I met Stephen. And I've known him ever since. And we've been doing really great work for all kinds of organizations.
Thanks for sharing that. So let's just jump into the nitty gritty. And Stephen, we'll start with you. Nonprofit, real estate, two, generally speaking, very different spheres. What are the opportunities that nonprofits can think about with respect to real estate? Because often I think, when I was running my nonprofit, the only time I ever thought about real estate was when my lease was up, right? Or like I needed more space, but it sounds like there's more to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I tell people that I don't know that I work in nonprofit real estate, they always look at me like I have two heads and that it's an oxymoron. But people who work in program facing nonprofits or nonprofits that use space to deliver on mission really understand that it's a critical part of how they deliver and the financial stability of the organization. So nonprofits have some special opportunities available to them that for-profit counterparts do not. So because of their tax exempt status, they have access to things like tax exempt bond financing, a program that allows you to get essentially loans that are very long term that can cover 100% of the cost of a project, but at interest rates that are substantially less than the current marketplace. So right now, if you're looking at getting a traditional loan, it's in the 6 to 7% range, and nonprofits are able to do loans in the 4 to 5% range, and that's a huge power and huge savings that's only available to nonprofits. But there's a lot of things like that, such as when you pay for your office space, you pay real estate taxes as part of your rent. And if you know how to structure the deal the right way, you can structure it to take out those costs. So that's 25% of the money that you normally spend on your rent is going to real estate taxes. And so if you know how to structure the deals in the right way, you can take that money and reallocate it directly towards program. So oftentimes that, real estate is the second largest line item on a nonprofit's expenses annually. And if they can save 25% of that and put it back into programs that can, that's more staff that can do direct service. And when we work with a nonprofit on developing their 3 to 5 year strategic plan, real estate needs to be a part of that conversation, because if it's not thought of proactively, oftentimes it can become a barrier to delivering on your mission. If it's, for example, if you're working with an organization that is serving a specific population that has high security needs, maybe even something like domestic violence, and you're in a building that has security protocols that force folks to show multiple forms of identification when they're otherwise supposed to be in an environment of anonymity, that doesn't work. And so if you're working in that space, your real estate can be a barrier. But alternately, if you're in the right type of space, and in that domestic violence space, just to give an example, you don't want to be located in the exact neighborhood that the folks are coming from. You want to be far enough away so that there's physical separation that people don't see you. So understanding what communities they're coming from, locating in the right communities to provide that buffer and barrier can provide these services to folks in a way that supports what they're trying to achieve versus a barrier.
Yeah, that's a really helpful example. It's something that I honestly had not considered, but that's obviously very relevant. So, Amy, over to you. Just something that occurred to me because I'm from San Francisco. I was recently in downtown San Francisco, and it was like a ghost town. With the vacancy rates being pretty high and a lot of remote working, are there any opportunities that you see that nonprofits can take advantage in this moment?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that leads to part of I'll just start from the plan. I'm going to answer this, but I'm going to go back a little bit to what you said before about, oh, I only, as a nonprofit leader, I'm thinking about my real estate, when my lease expires. So one thing is that we like to tell our clients is to plan early and get in front of these things much sooner than that, right? So that so that you're not stuck in a position where you can't take advantage of these opportunities in the market. So you should be starting, you should at least, at any nonprofit leaders on this call should, check your leases and make sure, see how much time you have left, and give yourself the opportunity at least a year to be prepared for what's next. And yes, there are a lot of opportunities in the market. There's a lot of opportunities for folks who are leasing space to get really good deals, not only in the kinds of buildings that you're in, but potentially to even upgrade your space and take on, you might want to perhaps downsize because you've included more hybrid work in your environment, but that doesn't mean you don't need space. And it means you could potentially be getting better space. You could be, in a better location, in a better building for the same amount of money, or perhaps even less in today's environment. And then there are also great opportunities for organizations that have a very long-term perspective and and are in a position where they might want to buy or do a leasehold condominium structure, which requires a 30-year commitment. But there, if you did a leasehold condominium, you would drop your costs dramatically, maybe by $12-15 a square foot, because you take the tax out of that. Or if you're willing, if you can purchase in today's environment because you know that I have a certain need and I need to be in this market in, I don't know, downtown San Francisco, there are absolutely deals to be had in today's market. It really depends. A lot of folks are looking at flexibility in their portfolios as well. And so it depends on what kind of commitments you can make, but we can also build flexibility into your deal structures, the ability to get out early, the ability to take common spaces in a building and use the landlord amenities to serve some, maybe you don't take a conference room that takes up a lot of space, you use Convene or some other, entity. So there are a lot of ways to do that and to take advantage of the market today. Absolutely. I don't know if you want to add something, Stephen, but.
Just exactly what you said about, being opportunistic. Just to give some examples, we track the market very carefully, and we track the market as it applies to nonprofits, not as well as the holistic market. So when you hear about rents, traditionally they're talking about the Class A buildings, or the average of all the buildings, and nonprofits don't traditionally locate themselves in these trophy buildings. So historically, nonprofit rents are about 25 to 35% less than their for-profit counterparts on average. But in today's market, what's happened is that there's a real push to get people in the office as part of the labor strategy. So if you want people to come in for collaboration and for culture building activities, the for-profit sector, where they seemingly have limitless money to spend on their occupancy expense, are locating in these trophy buildings that have these double height spaces that are completely column free and multiple floors of amenity and food service, and are new construction primarily. In those buildings, the pricing is extremely high. It's actually at historic highs, over $200 a foot in some of these trophy buildings. Then there's the buildings that are the A- and B+ buildings, and those are the buildings that nonprofits really like to be in: professional and affordable and super transit oriented, so that people can get to and from. And this is all around the country, not just in cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. But in those areas where these B+, A- buildings, the rents have come down substantially. So, for example, one building that's in a neighborhood pre-pandemic versus now, we were able to do a deal that was 50% less than when it was just pre-pandemic. And the landlords who are able to do this are the ones that are long-term ownership and want to meet the market and cover their expenses to fill the vacancy. Because as everyone is looking to take a little bit less space to account for hybrid work, and maybe they're adding more culture building and collaboration spaces to it, they're all shrinking a little bit. That's creating a huge vacancy in these A- B buildings. And you can either choose to do a deal and meet the market, and if you're an opportunistic nonprofit, you can take advantage of that. Or some of them that have financing on the building, where there's loan covenants that prevent them from being able to do deals below a certain dollar amount because it puts them in default, can't do it. So you need to know the right buildings where they're able to actually meet the market. But if you work with someone who understands that, and you have enough long-term perspective to know what the future holds, you can lock in an opportunity now at 50% lower rents for the long term, and put yourself in a strong position when the market comes back.
So that's actually an interesting question, and I don't know that certainly don't have a good answer, but we know that for many nonprofits that depend on philanthropic dollars, there can be some uncertainty and volatility with the market and your cash flow forecasting. So I'm just curious how you help nonprofits sort of hedge against, an uncertain market when they're taking on a big expense like, office space.
Well, I'll jump in, and Amy, please correct me. So, one of the things that we can do, especially in this market where we have more leverage as a tenant, is nonprofits can do things to build in flexibility, like Amy mentioned earlier on. But that flexibility are things like termination options in the event of loss of funding. So we have a client that has a building in Jamaica, Queens. And what we did was they were on 3 separate floors of the building. And with a dedicated entrance, they actually were serving folks. They had a youth drop-in center there, as well as a whole host of wraparound programs for families, foster care, the whole combination, food services. And because that building had, 19 different programs that were operating out of it, and some of it was philanthropic based and some of it was contract based, they needed to plan ahead to build in flexibility that if they lost one of those contracts, they could release part of the space. So we set it up that on a half floor by floor basis, we could, if we demonstrated that we lost funding of a certain amount, we could terminate that portion of the lease. And that allowed for flexibility, but not giving up space that they otherwise needed for the rest of the program. So you don't want to have only the option to give all or none. You want to have, ideally, the best of both worlds to be able to contract when you need to. And then on the flip side, expansion options, the option to take adjacent space at pre-negotiated terms. And in this market, you can get all of those things. And you can build the space to plan for that flexibility. So in this circumstance, we designed the air conditioning systems, the electric systems, everything to be intentionally segmented on a half floor by floor basis so that they could contract as they were able to, if they needed to. And we're actually taking advantage of some of that now.
Really interesting points. Amy, did you have something to add?
Stephen really covered it. Good.
Great. So again, I know basically nothing about commercial real estate. So if these questions don't make sense, please let me know. But we think a lot about the amount that we're spending on rent as an expense. Is there ever a world where nonprofits can start to think about their real estate as a potential revenue generator?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Take it away, Amy.
Well, I'll start and then there are many cases of that, and there are organizations that we're helping with that now, especially organizations that have portfolios of assets, owned assets, where you can leverage those assets to generate revenue for the organization. For example, we're working with some religious organizations, and they very typically are asset rich and cash poor. And maybe have maintenance that they need on their buildings. And there are opportunities to, lease portions or even parts of the portfolio of assets that they have to other nonprofit organizations. The benefit of that also is that those organizations that are, nonprofits, when you lease to a nonprofit, you're passing on your real estate tax benefit. So if you're renting from a traditional landlord, you're paying not just the rental amount, but also included in that is the tax portion of that, the real estate tax. But when you're a nonprofit renting from another nonprofit, you can get a better deal, right? Because there is no real estate tax in that, right? So a lot of these organizations can find wonderful tenants that help support their organization financially with assets that they have that they don't necessarily need to utilize now. And they can also structure that, if you're a portfolio, maybe you're not a religious organization, maybe you're a social service organization, and you have some assets where you don't need them now, but you may need them in the future. You can structure deals where they are shorter term or more flexible as well, so that you can bring in some cash now and take back the asset, expand back into it later as needed. In some cases, and we've helped them with this, it makes sense, for organizations to sell assets that they have as part of their portfolio and perhaps take something else what you want is the real estate to be right sized and suited for your organization. You don't want to be paying a lot of expense on assets you don't need, right? So by potentially selling off something that you've downsized or you've changed over the years how you deliver on your mission, it might make sense to actually sell that and take something else, either owned or leased, that makes sense for you to be right sized and have the right expense profile for who you are today, right? Yeah. And in that consideration, as part of the strategic planning that Stephen talked about, thinking about, not just who you are today, but what might we be 3 to 5 years from now? And how do we think about this more holistically as an organization so that we're supporting ourselves and sustaining ourselves long term?
I just have one. Oh, go ahead, Ray. Yeah.
Uh, well, just to follow up on that point. So Amy, I was thinking about when I signed a lease on some office space downtown. And one of the challenges that I had was thinking about the fact that we needed program space, right? Because we ran after school and summer programs, but we didn't need it all the time. And
Right.
so how might somebody think about, flexible space that is sort of, you know, only used sort of intermittently for like after school or summer
Right.
programs?
We work with lots of organizations like that. And there are different, I would say there are different ways to skin the cat depending on the organization and what it is that you need. So sometimes, that space can be, again, through another nonprofit that has program, sometimes that program space is ground floor, it needs people to be able to walk in or something, but you can work with other entities to lease that space on a as needed basis and move in and out of that space. That's a very typical sort of scenario. It also depends on how long you need it. And whether you need to, you just need it this year or, or you need it in perpetuity. But, you can also, I'm just thinking you can take, short-term leases, in today's market, because retail is not doing as well as it has in the past, there are lots of opportunities for sort of pop-up or short-term leases of those kinds of spaces as well. So it's really just dependent on like who you are and what your needs are. And yeah.
But to jump on to Amy's point, though, that sometimes you might also know that you need space only a given hour of the day. So you might know that you need just after school. And we've had a lot of very successful partnerships with schools that don't need the space after school hours. So a lot of churches will have partnerships with school tenants, and as part of the deal, we'll have a ability to use the classroom space after hours. Um, and then on the monetizing front, one thing that people always think of is that they can either sell or they can do a traditional lease. But a third option is something called a ground lease. And so one of the religious organizations we worked with was, had been there for a very long time in a neighborhood that had gone from being downtrodden to very wealthy, the West Village. And so in the West Village, they had the luxury of actually having land around this church. And instead of selling it to a developer to build, luxury residential, they decided to, through thinking through what they wanted, to preserve the future optionality and do a 99-year ground lease so that they would be able to have an annual revenue stream that could support and sustain the organization, and then be able to use that money to invest in programs and potentially save up some money to be able to build something on another portion of the property. And in that whole scenario, we actually had a shared space arrangement with a school where they also had a long-term lease. And so we could continue to use the classrooms and have a partnership between the school and the church, so that, one of the important things is if you do share space, you have to constantly communicate, so that make sure you have a weekly meeting, so that you know that you can touch base on any little things. We have a motto that if you don't over communicate, something else will come in to fill that space that's generally pretty negative. So keep that communication going, especially when you're in a partnership.
Yeah, having shared space, I can attest to that. All of the tension that we ever experienced was about the shared space. And like, did you move my eraser? You're like, okay, no one touched your eraser.
You have to be very clear about operations, who's cleaning the bathroom and putting the toilet paper and all of those little things that can add up over time. Yeah.
So one of the things that I think I've heard a lot of my nonprofit leader friends think about as they've seen, remote working and so forth is a co-working space.
Mhm.
Curious if you have any perspective about the pros and cons of a co-working space.
Well, I have a lot of perspective on that topic, not just in my work here at Open, but in prior work. So I ran a portfolio of assets for Citigroup where we use co-working space very often. A lot of times in that environment, we used it as swing space. or as expansion or contract, to build in flexibility in your model, right? So if you are in an office building, it's great to be in an office building, for example, that has co-working in it. And if you are, potentially growing beyond what you have currently, you can take a year or two of space in a co-working facility that's adjacent to the space you have and be able to expand and grow in that way until you move into your new longer term lease. You can also use it a lot of times as swing space. So I need to get out of my lease. Maybe I didn't plan far enough ahead, and I need to move, but I don't want to just have no leverage and not find the right space. So perhaps I move into a co-working environment for a year while I'm looking for my new long-term home. And so I'm still supported. I still have everything I need, but then I use that time to find the right space and have the leverage to negotiate a good deal for myself versus being under pressure of time. Those are the two ways I see it used the most. The third way that's probably very common for, I've also done this with smaller nonprofits, is when you start, you don't need a lot of space. You might need a desk. And so perhaps you start in a co-working space and you grow in that environment. But at a certain point, what I've done a lot of is moving people out of co-working because once you've grown to a certain point, it doesn't necessarily serve your needs anymore. One of the things you can do in co-working is divide it up so that it's your own office space within the co-working. They have a business platform where it's branded and it's exclusive. Well, when you're small, it's not like that, right? It's much more shared environment and other things about it. But as you grow to a certain point, you either need to be more self-contained, maybe you have security concerns, other things, or you need to move. That's typically how I see it.
Yeah, and our clients, any organization that had previously been in a dedicated space that wasn't shared and then moved into co-working environment, worked with hundreds of nonprofits and maybe dozens that have done this for a period of time. No one likes it. They actually hate the culture, or the I don't want to use the, but it's definitely, there's the keg and the bro-tastic culture does not jive super well with the nonprofit culture that people are looking for. And in a nonprofit, a big part of why people work for a given organization is because they want to be connected to that mission. And if they're in a co-working space, it's really hard to feel connected to that mission when it's really not about the organization. It's about it's about the sort of neutral environment that's not really specified to them. So we've actually, in this marketplace, and people are needing to swing, like Amy said, because they need a temporary thing, or they're not sure of their long-term plans, what's really popular are these dedicated smaller subleases that are short-term, because then they can still preserve that culture and preserve their identity and not take on so much space because they're in a period of change.
Yeah, I think the work experience is really important. And I know, especially now that like labor is short, holding on to staff is hard. So can you speak about the importance of, having a nice space that people like to come to, balanced against the fact that, nonprofits are pretty price sensitive and they're looking for the best deals, which may not necessarily, well, certainly in many cases is not like the fanciest office space. So like, how do we manage that tension? Stephen, let's start with you.
Okay, yeah. So we worked with a group called KIP, which is a large charter school network, and they also have an organization called KIP Foundation, which is the foundation that supports the KIP charters around the country. And co-location of multiple organizations is oftentimes very difficult because you have competing interests. But in the scenario of the foundation and the New York City KIP operation, there was a lot of synergies for them to consider co-locating. And one of the things they were able to do is find a building that was really one of the most affordable possible buildings, and co-locate and share things like support spaces and meeting rooms. And there was this outdoor terrace area. And one of the things that you can do is if you make the individual workstations as dense as possible, but then offer folks another place, a soft seating area, a phone booth or Zoom room, or a small or medium or large meeting room. If you have a diversity of other support shared spaces, you can do a lot more with less square footage, so that you can flex up. Let's say, for example, you don't not everybody who works at the organization has a dedicated seat at the headquarters, but they can come in and they can sit in a meeting room or a conference room or a soft seating area when they need to come in for large trainings and so on. So there are ways to be smart about how you plan for your space to take less dedicated personal workspace and allow you to do more with less.
And I'll add to what Stephen said. I've done a lot of work in the past for organizations around the future of work and what is the future workplace environment and back to work strategy throughout the pandemic. And so some of what we've been talking about is really that, and there are differing opinions on what that should be, certainly. But one thing that seems clear across the board is the concept of culture building and training and mentorship and development of people. And if you're not together in an environment together, especially if you're as a new employee, like a lot of people were hired brand new during the pandemic and they've never met their colleagues in person, and so that coupled with what you brought up previously about the opportunities that exist in the marketplace. So you can design a space that's much more collaborative and conducive to culture building and opportunities for mentorship, getting people back into the office in this more hybrid kind of work environment, and an environment where there are spaces to interact. Like even, it's really important even just to have like a coffee, a pantry to get, like a lot of times you just have a conversation with someone when you're getting coffee, right? And that could be critical to your whole day because you said, oh, I'm thinking, and they say, oh, I know the answer to that, right? So like having just that interaction. So the marketplace today, there are a lot of opportunities to upgrade and have better space where you can build a lot of that stuff in. And there are also, a lot of landlords that will construct your space for you as part of the total package. They have tenant improvement allowances. And so you can build a very nice conducive space to the kind of collaboration and culture building you want as a nonprofit, and have sort of an upgrade to what you might have had previously.
So last question for me, and then I see a good question from Danielle coming in. How do we manage the competing priorities? So like, let's say there's a world where I serve a very specific geographic area and I have to be in that area, but I'm priced out. So like the amount of space that I would need is just not affordable in that given space, but I have to be in that location because we offer the programs there. So I'm wondering, like, is there a world where real estate needs clash with strategic needs?
All the time. So we're working with an organization that serves a very specific community, and the cost of this neighborhood has gone up quite a bit. It's actually in Forest Hills, Queens, and it's a very attractive place to live, and there's not a lot of commercial product. And this organization serves seniors and has historically been renting from a synagogue and using the undercroft of a synagogue as a senior center. And that worked great, and they were paying $12 a foot, which in real estate terms is almost nothing. And the synagogue is being sold, and they no longer can count on this sort of below market space. And so they get funded by, and this is getting kind of in the weeds of, but it's important. They get funded by an organization called DIFTA, which is the city agency that funds senior services. And there's a process for most public funding sources that if your historic rent is not really achievable, there's sort of an appeal process to get a bigger contract. And it's not immediate. You have to plan ahead for these things. So oftentimes you can start a conversation, and then if in a couple of years that you're going to need to move, they can start allocating more resources towards your real estate. So from a public funding perspective, there's almost always a path if the public funding wants you to be in those neighborhoods. From a private dollars perspective, it's very difficult to just raise money overnight, as everyone knows. But one of the things that's great about being in a relatively pricey neighborhood is it's oftentimes very visible. So you can do a capital campaign around specifically owned real estate if you have a long enough term perspective, but it's a very attractive way to build a capital campaign, having a location and naming rights and all the things that go along with that, because it really does, appeal. You're definitely more of an expert at this to me, but the concept of living, the donor can live forever through those types of donations. That's a very powerful fundraising strategy, and we've seen that happen quite a bit. I'd love for Amy to tell the story of what Screen Actors Guild was able to do.
Oh, I'd love to. Can I share two stories really quick?
Yeah, and then we'll get to Danielle's question, then we'll wrap it up.
So just one thing I wanted to say, and then I'll share the Screen Actors scenario, is just, a lot of work that we do is with charter schools throughout the boroughs. And what I was going to say is that not just the location itself, but sometimes the market environment. So in today's market environment, for example, a lot of charter schools are ground up development, and the market today for construction, just the cost of materials has gone up dramatically, as has, we all know, interest rates and the financing costs. So these things that used to be, we do a lot of work, for example, in the Bronx, which in the past was, much more affordable and has become less so over time, especially for those kinds of projects because of the costs of construction and development. And what I was going to say is just that what we've found, what we try to do is be creative in deal structuring and thinking about, well, how else can we do this thing and still achieve the mission, the outcome that we're looking for. So in that environment, what we found lately is that, because we have a long-term perspective, we've been finding opportunities where the nonprofit can actually purchase the asset instead of leasing it from the developer, and fund it with doing tax exempt bond financing, which the interest rate is much lower than conventional interest rates. And so when you run those numbers, you wind up in the first couple of years, it winds up being a bit more expensive, but over the duration, much less expensive than today's leasing environment. And those nonprofits that have the credit, that are established enough and have a history that folks are, comfortable lending, they can get much, much better deals. And we're starting to do deals like that versus the ones we used to do in the past, which were straight up leases for, 30 years, leasehold condos, basically. But we're running numbers that are better. And so like a lot of times it's also like just shifting your perspective, maybe like how else can I think about the market and the opportunities that exist in it where I can still achieve my mission, but think about my real estate a little bit differently.
Interesting.
The Screen Actors Guild one that one is really more about something that we talked about for ages, Stephen and I, being intelligently opportunistic. It means planning well so that you know what you need, you know what you can afford, so that when you go out to the market, you're never going to find the exact thing you were thinking. It's very rare that you say, I planned this all out and this is the thing that I'm going to find exactly as it is. In the Screen Actors Guild, we did an extensive planning process for their new Actors Center that included, not just a screening room, but also voiceover and space for actors in between gigs to meet up and et cetera. And when we went out to the marketplace, we couldn't find all of that in one, but what we found were pieces of it. And we said, you know what, that can work for us, because, and it wound up being the Robin Williams Center on 54th Street. That's the Screen Actors Guild screening room. And so we found this space that was exceptionally affordable for a variety of reasons, the city government and the developer getting, air rights to build up. So they had to give this space to the community at a lower cost. So we took advantage of that. And we said, oh, that fits we know how, the physical requirements, we know our budget, blah, 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 we can do this. And we could put the rest of the facility in a traditional office space nearby, but elsewhere, and still make this thing work how we intended.
Yeah, that's Amy, as you were talking, I was just thinking about, because, I love a dating analogy, which is there's no such thing as the one, right? You can never find the one who's going to meet all of your needs. All right, Danielle, you have a great question. You want to jump in here?
Sure. Hello. Thank you. This has been really useful and interesting. I was wondering, and you touched on it a little bit, Amy, just now. There's certain government initiatives that are happening. And I know for Brooklyn in particular, in New York City, Brooklyn Borough President Reynoso has included financing. He's going to dedicate money towards nonprofits that are acquiring real estate. And I know, like, there's been incubators, and Industry City at one point had some nonprofit angles to it, I believe, but it was done through Economic Development Administration. So it's just, I'm being very New York specific for all those listeners out there, but I'm sure nationwide, there's lots of government initiatives like that. And I'm just wondering, is that like a growing trend? Are those things useful? Are they convoluted? Just some thoughts on that.
I guess I'll start. We have done work with lots of nonprofits who have allocations from from borough presidents, from other electeds through different. Currently, even there's a lot of funding for migrant housing, unaccompanied youth. All of those. It's a very big deal nationally and here in New York. And I would say a little bit. It depends. Sometimes those monies come, most of the time they're for capital, not for operating costs. And there are sort of requirements associated with using pre-approved project management and construction and other things where you have to go through a very specific process for the city. So it can be very beneficial, but you also really need people who understand how these things work to make sure you don't get hung up and stuck with some of the bureaucracy and issues that are associated with taking those monies, I would say.
Yeah, like public money oftentimes comes with strings. So the quick, like short version of it is that if you use money for capital, oftentimes you have to restrict the property for at least 25 years. You have to use union and prevailing wage, which can increase the cost of construction by 20 to 100%. And you have to have a much more detailed reporting process, which also adds time and cost to a project. But if you use the capital for things that's movable, that like furniture, fixture, equipment, or anything that you could take with you, the restrictions are much, much less because they really just need to stay owned by the nonprofit community. And in those scenarios, we worked with an organization in Brooklyn that had the capital to pay for the renovation of their theater space. It was a performing arts music organization, but they didn't necessarily have the money to pay for some of their lighting grids and technology, as well as something that it was important to have this very special piano that was this like perfect piano. So this piano was $1 million. And they got the borough president to give them $1 million to buy this piano. And they already had one. So now they have dueling $1 million pianos. So you got to be smart about how you ask for the money, but sometimes they have to spend it. So you can sometimes take advantage of the fact that if they don't spend it, they're going to lose it. So they're willing to give you money that you oftentimes would think would be impossible to achieve.
I love that dueling $1 million pianos. That's a first here on Nonprofit Lowdown. Well, Stephen, Amy, this has been really great. Is there anything else that we should know about, be aware of, anything that we haven't covered so far?
I think the biggest big picture is that this is an opportunity to take advantage of really unprecedented times, and that you can set yourself up as an organization for really long-term affordability and success. And it's also a great time to make a change. The big disruptor that was the lockdown has forced people to rethink a lot of things, and you can make bigger changes now with less painful change management. So we are encouraging our clients to dream big and think about the vision for the organization, and then we can help you figure out a real estate strategy that supports that.
Good to know.
I'll just add super quick that it's never too early to start. like all nonprofit organization leaders should be checking their leases and should look and may, should reach out and have a conversation. You may not do something now, but you should think about, what it is you could do. What are the possibilities to take advantage of this environment and to dream big and to think about, maybe you can even get out of your lease. You should check it out.
Awesome. Yeah. Let's take advantage of an opportunity, y'all. So
Yeah.
Stephen, Amy, thank you so much for joining us. I'll make sure that all of your information is in the show notes, link to the website and your LinkedIn if folks want to get in touch with you. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yep.
Thank you.